Alright gang, welcome back. So here we are, we're in lecture 1-2. And in 1-2, I'm going to talk about this first module, the first chapter in the book, and where the book is. So if we click in the Module 1 overview page, we click on course resources, it will take us to a link. Here's the ISBN number for the book, the author, the name of the book, but we've got a little more than just this book available to us in this O'Reilly Books for Higher Education repository. And that's just what it is. It's a repository. It allows us access to a huge volume of different textbooks, videos, entire courses. So I'm not just giving you access to one book. I'm giving you access to everything in there. And it doesn't cost you anything. So there's the best part of it. So if you click in there, that'll take you to here. And you'll go in and look for Mastering Active Directory. And the same author, Deshaun Francis, he's got two items in here. So one of them is what we're dealing with, is Mastering Active Directory, the 3rd edition. There's also Mastering Active Directory. That's an audiobook, so it's everything in here, just some guy reading it to you. So if you wanted to, you can put that on and just listen to it. Or you can go read it yourself and actually see the images, visuals, the diagrams, etc., that are huge. I should say very important when it comes to this course. So this is the one we're dealing with. You can go create on your profile. Come click and you can create a playlist. And then I click on my playlist. And then anything that you have important to you, you can add to your personal playlist. So I've got this one, course texts. So different courses. I use this Network Plus certification one. I use that as part of my 2792 course. If you weren't 100% ready for 2792, here, this will help you get there. Now, there's an assumption that you've taken either 2792 or 2794 before you get to this course, Active Directory. So there's skills that you should have coming in. If you don't have them, let me know. I can point you to resources. Much like me pointing my 2792 students to this. It's an entire course prepping you for Net Plus. You've all got access to it now for free. So you can go do a search up here for that if you want access to this N10-008 course. So we're going to focus here. Come in here. Let's open it up. It took me right back where I left off in Chapter 1, Active Directory Fundamentals. And that's what we're going to cover in this first module. Now, in this module, I'm going to go down through what's taken place in here in this first video, 1-2. In 1-3, 1-4, and 1-5, those 3 videos are not videos I created. I'm pointing you to resources outside that, hey, here's a great source for info on Active Directory. There's another good resource, info on the components of Active Directory or identity management, whatever it may be. Okay. So as we go through things, there'll be videos from me. I'm not just going to point you to, well, here's all videos somebody else did and none of it's me. By the same token, I'm not going to overwhelm you with everything coming from me. I'm going to give you a mix because there's a lot of great resources out there. Okay? So, with that said, let's look at what we've got here. And if we go in the table of contents for this module, this chapter, we're dealing with Active Directory fundamentals. And it's broken down into access management, identity and access management, different domain services, benefits of using Active Directory, understanding Active Directory components, and the different objects that are within Active Directory. Now, in those 3 videos that I've added in, actually there's 4. I've got 3 videos there, but I got a link to a 4th that's not a big tile, it's just a hyperlink. And it's a, I'm trying to think of which one it was. I think it's in the same area as 1 dash, it's in the same area as this one, 1-2. So to the right of this video, I've got a link in there that'll take you to this video from the same individual that is within the 1-3 video. And it's his video that precedes what I provided in 1-3 from him. And it's installing and configuring Server 2022. So it's a refresh from 2792. Let's assume let's say you took 2794. You haven't taken installing and configuring the server yet. Well, this will walk you through doing the installing and configuring of it. I'm going to have virtual machines in the coming modules to where you'll be able to connect to a Hyper-V server. It's living on the Lake Worth campus, and you can go in and play around with a Windows Server 2022 virtual machine configuration. You'll configure it however you want. You'll actually be able to configure little networks, have more than one device on the network and connect them and configure them and create groups and policies, etc. So a great lab to go in and play with. So the things we'll see here, the things you'll see in the videos that I've got for you, you will be able to apply them in an actual server, but you'll be doing it remotely. So with that said, what's Active Directory, and why do we have to deal with something like that? What's it all about? Well, Active Directory is essentially managing the resources within the network. And when I say resources, what kind of resources are we talking about? People, devices, maybe the services or roles that are taking place. There's a lot of stuff going on in networks, and we've got to have a network operating system that has the ability to deal with, let's say, user identities or the identities of different devices on the network. So Active Directory's been around for 2 decades now, and it's something that we've gotten really used to using, gotten really good at managing the resources, and we have the ability to treat them all the same, but at the same time recognize them as individuals. So with identity and access management, one is the resource itself, and the other is what access is associated with that resource. So if we're talking about a user, well, that user has access to certain things. We're talking about another kind of resource. That other resource can only be accessed by certain people, and we've got to be able to have some kind of control over that. And we deal a lot with that in 2794, the policies and privileges. But in this one, we're dealing more with the infrastructure itself and everything that's going on here. So, with all of the hacking and the system breaches and the cyber crime, Active Directory is one of our best resources to be able to manage the resources on the network. Now, we've got security we've got to deal with. We look at worst case scenarios. We don't want to have low level security. We want to have as high level security as we can, but at the same time we don't want to deny access to users that should have access, because we've locked things down so tightly that we make it difficult for them to access it. I think about students complaining about two-factor authentication. Well, it's a lot better than other options that are available to us. And it's a great way for us to help lock down a system. We've got different types of identifiers, whether we're talking about some certificates, some digital ID, biometrics, whatever it may be, some way to identify the individual. We've got hybrid modes of dealing with it. I can deal with a user as being a member of a group. You inherit permissions and abilities associated with, or privileges associated with, being a group member. And we're not talking just about a standalone server. We're also talking about things that could be taking place on Azure, on the cloud. So I want you to look at both things as we go through this, both standalone servers, and if we were dealing with Azure or AWS. Now this is all going to lean towards Azure because we're dealing with a Microsoft product. But we're not limited to just Azure servers. Something I mentioned in 2792 early on is I want you to also, as we're going through doing what we're doing, I want you to be exploring new things. I want you to look at things like what we're talking about here for the most part is a traditional on-premises server. And a lot of people will call it a legacy system. But we've got to look beyond that and look at these servers don't necessarily have to live in my office. They could be cloud-based. And when we start moving things out to the cloud, like we're talking about here with Azure, I can have Azure manage my Active Directory. I can also have Azure manage infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and there's far, far more than just those three: IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. I just want to kind of put the seed there, put that idea in your head toward go explore that. Feel free to jump into Module 1 discussion and say, here's what I found relative to these concepts that you were talking about, or I was talking about, in this one lecture. Okay. So there's a lot of what we're doing here that we need to look at as cloud-based and kind of, I want to say, compartmentalizing or specializing things. We don't need a server that does everything. We can have task-oriented servers. And we'll talk at some point, probably talk about Dockers and containers when it comes to cloud-based servers. Okay. So that said, why use Active Directory? Well, it's a central repository that keeps track of everything and everybody in the system. And if we got a central repository to keep track of all this information, who should have access to what, we shouldn't have any problems, as long as it's updated on a regular basis. So it's where we keep all the rules and make sure there's order within our network. So with that said, we've got this centralized data repository. We're able to replicate it and have iterations of it elsewhere. We'll deal with that towards the end of the course. It enhances security. We've got to look at things from two standpoints when it comes to Active Directory. I've got logical components and we've got physical components. Now, logical components are how things are laid out. The organizational structure of it. And we think about, we're going to break down the organization into a tree of sorts with branches and leaves, and the head of the organization's at the top, and it's almost like the tree's upside down, and each employee down at the bottom is the individual leaves. And as we look at how this thing's all laid out, that's not a physical structure, that's logical structure. We also deal with the physical structure, how things are physically connected to one another. Right, so we've got logical components and physical components. And we'll talk about forests, to where we set up different domains within a forest. And they're connected, but they may not need access to each other's resources. So there's reasons why we go about doing the things that we go about doing within Active Directory. We'll talk more about the different versions of server that have come along the way. It's about every 3 to 4 years we'll come out with a new version, or Microsoft come out with a new version of server. Within server, we've got different flavors or levels of server. Meaning, is it something that is just command line, or just using it in PowerShell, or is it a GUI? And depending on what we're dealing with, these operating systems can get very heavy, very bloated, to the point that we can't even fit them on DVDs. They're that big now. There's that much going on in them. So we look at a forest, and we've got domains in the forest, and then we've got subdomains. This type of logical structure is the kind of thing that we've got to manage within our Active Directory. And if we go through this, we'll get familiar with it over and over. Now, we create things called organizational units. And organizational units can be kind of tricky. I see people run into problems with them. Now, we've got users within our server, and we're used to dealing with users. But a user can only be a member of one organizational unit. You can't be a member of two organizational units. groups, that's different. But here we're talking about an organizational unit structure, and within a domain, a lot of times we'll say, all right, we've got this domain controller, and in that domain we'll create an organizational unit associated with that domain. And here they use sales as an example of an organizational unit. You couldn't be a member of another organizational unit, just sales, if you were a member of sales. And we'll talk more about that moving forward, but that's a logical grouping. By being a member of that logical group, that could limit you to certain resources. Now, we've got the physical components, and those are the devices themselves, the domain controllers themselves, catalog servers, Active Directory sites that we can access. So we'll have redundancy within our system to where the information's not just stored on one device, it's on multiple devices. Should one fail, we've got redundancy. We can do load sharing to where one starts getting beat up, it starts shedding the load to another Active Directory server. And that's just a role. That's all it is. And first or second video, first and second video, we'll talk about the different roles. When I say first and second, beyond this one, talk about the different roles for the servers and the fact that we're dealing with Active Directory servers on these. So we can go in and create a new object, and the objects are what we will hopefully manage within our Active Directory. Okay, here's an example of us doing it, managing it in PowerShell. I'm not going to focus a whole lot in PowerShell, but we will deal with it in some degree. Now, different roles associated with Active Directory servers. So we've got Active Directory domain services, Federation services, lightweight directory services, rights management services, and certificate services. Touch on these in some videos now and in future modules. Okay. So if we wanted to go run PowerShell commandlets, here's how we'll go through and do it. Keep in mind, PowerShell is very unforgiving when it comes to syntax, capitalization, spelling, spacing, all that. Why would I use a PowerShell or command line only server? I may not have to interact with it often. I may want it to be lightweight. It uses a whole lot less resources running just commandlets in PowerShell compared to having to run a GUI and everything else associated with it. All right. So with that said, I'll see you in the next module. I'll see you in the discussions. Let's stay engaged in the discussions, and hope you enjoy the course.